Her story from Phoenix. My daughter-in-law served me expired food for a year, gray meat, curdled milk, bulging cans. She thought I was just a frail old woman. But then a visiting nurse leaned down and whispered a single question. Does she know you used to be her landlord? That moment, I remembered the eviction notice I had kept and the deed she had never seen. Meet Eleanor, a 78-year-old widow who arrived at her son's Phoenix home still wearing the black dress from her husband's funeral. She wasn't expecting luxury, just a roof and a warm meal. What she got instead was a year of carefully disguised torment, expired meat, curdled milk, cans on the verge of bursting, all served with a tight smile. Her daughter-in-law called it leftovers. Eleanor called it slow poison. But what no one in that house realized was that Eleanor didn't just live under their roof, she held the title to it. And the paperwork she had quietly hidden was about to turn a quiet victim into the most dangerous person in the room. This is how one question from a nurse ignited a reckoning no one saw coming. But to understand that question, you first have to understand the house and the history that lived inside its walls. Eleanor had never planned to live with her son. She and her husband George had bought a modest two-story in Phoenix back in the 1980s when the desert was still quiet and the neighbors left casseroles on your porch. They raised Michael there, watched him scrape his knees on the driveway, pinned his honor roll certificates to the fridge. The house was always meant to be a family home, but never a nursing home. Eleanor had her own plans, a little garden, a book club, maybe a trip to Sedona every autumn. But then, George got sick. Pancreatic. 6 months from diagnosis to the end. And suddenly, the house was too big. The silence too loud. Michael, now married and living in a newer part of Phoenix, came to the funeral, stood beside her at the grave, and said the words she'd been desperate to hear. "Come live with us, Mom. You shouldn't be alone." She believed him. She sold her furniture, packed her life into 2 suitcases, and arrived at his door still wearing the same black dress, her eyes swollen, but her heart full of something like hope. That was the first mistake. The woman who opened the door was Vanessa, Michael's wife of 12 years. She wore a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "Welcome home, Eleanor," she said, stepping aside just enough to let her pass. The house smelled of lemon cleaner and something faintly metallic. Vanessa had prepared a plate of food, gray slices of meatloaf, cold potatoes, a wilted salad. "Leftovers," Vanessa said with a shrug. "I'm sure you're not too hungry anyway." Eleanor thanked her and ate in silence while Michael disappeared into his office, already on his phone. That night, she lay in a guest bed that smelled of mothballs and dust, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the house, and told herself it would get better. But it did not get better. It got worse, so slowly that she almost didn't notice until it was too late. The first sign was the milk. Eleanor had always drunk a glass of warm milk before bed. George used to bring it to her every night. She went to the fridge on her 3rd morning, found a carton with a sell-by date from 2 weeks earlier, and poured a glass anyway. The first sip curdled on her tongue. She mentioned it to Vanessa, who laughed lightly. "Oh, I must have missed that one. I'll get fresh." The fresh never came. After that, the milk was always sour, the bread always stale, the fruit always soft in a way that felt intentional. Lunches appeared on the kitchen counter, thin sandwiches with curling edges, canned peaches in syrup that fizzed when you opened them. Dinners were whatever the family had eaten, scraped onto a plate hours later and left covered in plastic wrap in the fridge with a sticky note. For Eleanor. She told herself it was carelessness, a busy household. Michael worked long hours, Vanessa had the kids to manage. But then she started hearing the whispers. "She's old, she won't even taste it." Vanessa murmured one evening from the kitchen, her voice drifting through the crack in the dining room door. Michael said nothing, just the tap-tap of his thumbs on his phone screen. Another time, when Eleanor complained of stomach cramps that left her doubled over, Vanessa patted her hand and said, "It's probably just stress." Grief does strange things to the body. Michael nodded from across the room without looking up. When Eleanor's clothes started hanging loose, her wrists thinning, her cheeks hollowing, Vanessa smiled and remarked, "Well, you're finally trimming down. I wish I had your discipline." Discipline. As if losing 15 pounds in 3 months was a choice. As if the endless nausea and the trembling in her legs were signs of health. Eleanor grew too weak to join them at the table, so Vanessa began bringing trays to her room: oatmeal that tasted of metal, applesauce with a slimy film, canned soup poured straight from the can and barely warmed. The words "contact the doctor" never left anyone's lips. Instead, Michael said, "You're lucky to have a roof, Mom. A lot of people in your position don't." And because she was exhausted, because her mind had fogged over from malnutrition and grief, she believed him. She stopped questioning. She stopped complaining. She became the silent, grateful houseguest they wanted her to be, shrinking into the guest bed, her voice reduced to a whisper, her world reduced to 4 walls and a half-eaten bowl of something she no longer recognized as food. That was the moment the fall happened. She'd gotten up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, her legs unsteady, her vision swimming. The hallway was dark, the floor hard. She hit it with a crack that rattled her bones and lay there, too weak to scream, until Michael found her in the morning. That was when the visiting nurse arrived, a requirement after any fall involving a patient over 75. Her name was Rita, a stocky woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense clip to her voice. She checked Eleanor's vitals, pressed ice packs to her hip, and then paused, her eyes landing on the nightstand. The half-eaten bowl of applesauce. She leaned closer, saw the grayish sheen, the faint smell of fermentation. Her expression tightened. She knelt beside Eleanor's bed and asked, so softly no one else could hear, "Does she know you used to be her landlord?" Eleanor's breath caught. The words sliced through the fog like a scalpel. She hadn't thought about that in years. Before Michael married Vanessa, before the wedding, before the grandchildren, Vanessa had been a young woman renting an apartment in one of Eleanor and George's investment properties, a small 2-bedroom near downtown Phoenix. She paid her rent late most months, and when she'd begged for a reduction, Eleanor had said no. It was business, nothing personal. But Vanessa had stood in the doorway, her eyes dark with fury, and hissed, "You'll regret this." Eleanor had forgotten the threat entirely. For 12 years, it had never come up. But now, staring at the nurse, the truth crashed over her. Vanessa hadn't forgotten. She'd been waiting. And now, she had Eleanor exactly where she wanted her. The expired food, the isolation, the gaslighting. It wasn't neglect. It was payback. And worse, Eleanor suddenly remembered something else. Something so dangerous it made her heart pound. This house, the very house where she was being slowly erased, was not Michael's. It was not Vanessa's. The deed was in Eleanor's name. She owned it outright. And hidden beneath her mattress, in a manila envelope she'd kept since the day she moved in, was the original paperwork, the deed, the insurance documents, and the eviction notice she'd drafted years ago when a different tenant had caused trouble. No one knew she had it. No one had bothered to check. The nurse left that afternoon with a promise to follow up, and Eleanor lay in the fading light, her mind racing for the first time in months. She wasn't just a victim. She was the landlord, the owner, the one with the power. And as the house settled into its nighttime quiet, she reached down with trembling fingers and felt the edge of the envelope beneath the mattress, its paper crisp and reassuring. She pulled it out. She unfolded the deed. Her name was there in bold letters, and in that moment, a single thought crystallized. If Vanessa wanted to treat her like a tenant in her own home, then it was time to serve an eviction. But before she could take a breath, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. The bedroom door had no lock. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Eleanor shoved the envelope back under the mattress, her fingers trembling so hard she nearly tore the paper. She had just pulled the blanket into place when the door swung open without a knock. Vanessa stood in the doorway, a glass of water in her hand, her face arranged into an expression of soft concern. But Eleanor had learned to read the truth in the corners, the way Vanessa's eyes darted to the nightstand, then to the rumpled sheets. "I heard you moving around. The nurse said you took quite a fall. How are you feeling?" Eleanor forced a weak nod, her voice barely a whisper. "Just a bit dizzy, dear. I'll be fine." Vanessa stepped closer, setting the glass down on the nightstand beside the half-eaten applesauce. "You know, the nurse asked me some very strange questions. She seemed to think you weren't eating properly. I told her that's just your age. Appetites fade, don't they?" She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had long stopped pretending. Eleanor said nothing. The silence stretched, and in that silence, Eleanor felt something shift. Vanessa wasn't checking on her. She was hunting. Her gaze swept the room like a searchlight, landing finally on the edge of the envelope, peeking out from under the mattress. Eleanor stopped breathing. But before Vanessa could investigate, a child cried out from somewhere down the hall. Vanessa's head snapped toward the sound. "We'll talk later," she said, and left, the door clicking shut behind her. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She lay awake listening to the house settle, each creak a potential footstep. By morning, her decision was made. She couldn't wait for another tray of spoiled food. She couldn't wait for the next fall. The envelope beneath her mattress was a time bomb, and Vanessa had already spotted the fuse. She needed backup. She needed to get the documents out of that house before Vanessa found them. But she was too weak to drive, and her phone, an ancient flip model Michael had given her, had no signal in the bedroom. The landline in the hall was the only option, and using it meant risking being overheard. She waited until 10 in the morning when she knew Vanessa took the kids to a playgroup. Michael was at work. The house fell into a deep, echoing silence. She forced herself upright, the room spinning, and walked slowly to the hallway phone. Her fingers dialed a number she hadn't called in 5 years. It belonged to a man named Daniel Croft, a retired attorney who had handled George's estate. He answered on the 4th ring. "Mr. Croft, it's Eleanor. I need your help. I think my daughter-in-law is trying to harm me, and I have the deed to their house." There was a pause, then Croft's voice, steady and serious, "Tell me everything." She did. She told him about the expired food, the weight loss, the gaslighting, the overheard whispers. She told him about the rental history, the denied rent reduction, the threat Vanessa had made 12 years earlier. And she told him about the envelope. Croft listened without interrupting, then asked a single question. "Does the deed still list you as the sole owner?" Eleanor confirmed it did. Then, "You have more power than you realize. But you need to get that deed out of the house and into a secure place before they find it. I'll meet you at the county recorder's office this afternoon if you can make it. Bring everything." Eleanor hung up and nearly sagged to the floor. For the first time in a year, someone believed her. She retrieved the envelope, tucked it into the lining of her coat, and shuffled to the front door. But when she tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge. A keyed deadbolt gleamed above the knob, one she had never noticed before. She tried the back door. Same lock. The windows had security bars. Eleanor felt a cold wave of nausea. She was not a guest. She was a prisoner. She stood in the silent kitchen, her heart hammering, and noticed something she had missed every day for a year: a small security camera blinking red above the pantry. Vanessa wasn't just controlling the food, she was watching the entire house. And if she was watching, she already knew Eleanor had been on the phone. The phone rang. The caller ID read home. It was Vanessa's mobile. Eleanor stared at it for 3 rings, then picked up. Vanessa's voice was honeyed, but hard at the center. "Eleanor, I saw you were up and about. Feeling better? Good. I'll be home soon. Don't go anywhere. Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." The line went dead. Eleanor understood the subtext: "You're not leaving." She had perhaps an hour before Vanessa returned. She needed a plan. She went back to her room and scanned every object for solutions. Her eyes landed on the visiting nurse's business card, still tucked under the lamp. Nurse Rita had left her direct line. Eleanor called her, her voice low and urgent. "Rita, it's Eleanor. I know why you asked that question. You were right. But I'm trapped in the house, and I have documents that prove everything. Can you help me?" Rita didn't hesitate. "I'm still in the neighborhood. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Pack nothing. Just be ready to walk out with me." Eleanor's throat tightened with hope. She slid the envelope back inside her coat and sat by the front window, watching the clock. 8 minutes later, Rita's car pulled into the driveway. But before Eleanor could stand, another car swung in behind her. Vanessa's minivan. The 2 women stepped out of their vehicles at the same moment, and through the window, Eleanor saw them exchange words. Rita's posture was firm, confident. Vanessa's was suddenly friendly, gesturing toward the house. They were coming to the door together. Eleanor unlocked the deadbolt from the inside. It required a key. But she'd found the spare on the kitchen counter and opened the door just as Rita reached it. "Ma'am, I'm here to conduct a follow-up on Eleanor's fall. I'll need to see her privately." Vanessa's smile flickered. "Of course. But she's very frail. Any upset can worsen her condition." Rita stepped inside and gently took Eleanor's arm. "I'll be the judge of that." She led Eleanor into the bedroom and closed the door. "Show me the documents," she whispered. Eleanor handed over the envelope. Rita scanned the deed, her expression darkening. "This is a quitclaim deed from 1991. Your name is the only one on it. You own this property outright. And you said your daughter-in-law was a former tenant?" Eleanor nodded and quickly explained the late rent disputes. Rita's jaw tightened. "This isn't just elder abuse. This is retaliation. I'm calling Adult Protective Services and the police. But first, we're getting you out of here." She pocketed the envelope. "I'll keep these safe. No one here knows I have them." The bedroom door suddenly rattled. "Is everything okay in there?" Vanessa's voice, sugary and sharp. "We're fine," Rita called. To Eleanor, she whispered, "When we walk out, stay close to me. Don't say a word." They emerged. Vanessa's eyes dropped immediately to Rita's empty hands. "Leaving so soon?" Rita guided Eleanor toward the front door, her tone professional. "Eleanor needs a follow-up at the clinic. I'm taking her now." Vanessa stepped sideways, blocking the exit. "I'm afraid I can't allow that without my husband's consent. Eleanor is under our care. You can't just take her." Rita didn't flinch. Actually, under Arizona's elder protection statutes, a mandated reporter can facilitate emergency medical evaluation without family consent if reasonable suspicion of abuse exists. And I have plenty of suspicion. Vanessa's face went pale, then red. "Abuse? That's absurd. Look at her, she's old and confused. Whatever she told you is a fantasy." But Eleanor, standing in the doorway she had not been permitted to pass for a year, found her voice. It was hoarse, rusted from disuse, but clear. "Vanessa, you told me once that I'd regret saying no to you. I do regret it. But you forgot something. I still hold the title." Vanessa's eyes widened, and in that instant of shock, Rita pushed past her and guided Eleanor into the sunshine. The police arrived 2 hours later at the clinic. An officer named Harper took Eleanor's statement, photographed her weight chart. She had lost 23 pounds since moving in, and documented the food logs Rita had convinced her to keep. Meanwhile, Adult Protective Services issued an emergency protective order, banning Vanessa from contact until an investigation was complete. But Vanessa didn't wait. While Eleanor was still at the clinic, Vanessa went to the house, stormed into the guest room, and flipped the mattress. The envelope was gone. She tore through the closet, the dresser, the bathroom cabinets, finding nothing. Then she checked the camera logs and saw Eleanor on the phone with Rita. She realized the deed was no longer in the house. In a panic, she called Michael at work and screamed, "Your mother just stole our house." Michael arrived at the clinic that evening, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. He asked to see Eleanor alone, and the officers allowed it. He sat beside her bed, his voice low. "Mom, what did you do? Vanessa is losing her mind. She says you're trying to evict us. Is that true?" Eleanor looked at her son, the same boy who had once drawn her with a cape, who had brought her pink tulips, who now couldn't meet her eyes, and felt a grief deeper than the hunger. "Michael, do you know what your wife fed me for the last year?" "Spoiled meat, sour milk, food so rotten it made me sick. I lost 23 pounds under your roof. You never noticed." Michael's face crumpled. "I thought you were depressed. She said you weren't eating, that you were wasting away from grief." Eleanor's voice cracked. "She said I was trimming down." "And you believed her?" Michael stood up, pacing. "But the house, if you own it, we could lose everything. The kids, where will we go?" And in that moment, Eleanor understood something terrible. Her son was not horrified by the abuse she had suffered. He was horrified that its revelation might cost him his home. The next morning, Daniel Croft arrived at the clinic with a notary and a new legal document, a formal notice of termination of tenancy. It gave Michael and Vanessa 30 days to vacate the premises. Eleanor signed it with a steady hand. "Isn't there another way?" Michael pleaded. "We're family." Eleanor set down the pen. "Family doesn't lock me in a room and feed me poison. You have 30 days. Croft filed the notice with the county that afternoon. Vanessa received the papers at the front door, and her scream could be heard 3 houses down. But she wasn't done. That night, she called every family member she could, spinning a story of a demented grandmother ripping away her grandchildren's home out of spite. Michael's phone blew up with texts from cousins and aunts, demanding answers. Then Vanessa made one more call to a tabloid journalist who specialized in local scandals. The headline went live the next morning: "Grandma evicts her own son's family in bitter revenge plot." The story painted Eleanor as a vindictive, senile widow and Vanessa as the devoted caregiver. The public had no idea about the expired food, the locked doors, the security cameras, and Eleanor, still recovering in a temporary care facility, opened her laptop to find her name smeared across the internet. But what Vanessa didn't know, what she could never have anticipated, was that Nurse Rita had kept a meticulous paper trail. Every visit, every observation, every lab, result indicating malnutrition. And behind the scenes, Rita had been quietly working with Croft and a county investigator named Suarez to build a case not just for eviction, but for criminal charges of vulnerable adult abuse. The public smear campaign was about to backfire spectacularly. Because in her effort to destroy Eleanor's reputation, Vanessa had opened a door she couldn't close. And on the other side of that door was a forensic audit of every meal, every medical record, and every frame of surveillance footage from the camera above the pantry. The very footage that would prove Eleanor's story was true. But before that evidence could surface, Eleanor received an anonymous text from a number she didn't recognize. It read, "You think you've won? Check your blood pressure medication." She showed it to Rita. who immediately called the clinic pharmacist. The pills in Eleanor's bottle were not her prescribed dosage. They were double the strength, a dose that, combined with her frail state, could have caused a fatal cardiac event. Someone had tampered with them, and that someone still had access to her. The pharmacist confirmed it within the hour. The capsules in Eleanor's bottle were not her prescribed medication. They were a generic beta blocker at twice the dosage she had ever been prescribed, and they had been refilled just 3 days earlier by Vanessa, who had presented herself as Eleanor's authorized caregiver. When Detective Harper called Vanessa in for questioning, she arrived with a glossy smile and a prepared statement. "My mother-in-law is confused. She probably mixed up her own pills. You know how elderly people are." But Harper had already pulled the pharmacy records. There was no mix-up. The prescription refill request came from a phone number registered to Vanessa's mobile, and the pharmacy's security footage showed her picking up the order herself, chatting casually with the pharmacist about how well her mother-in-law was doing under her care. Eleanor was moved to a secure wing of the care facility that same evening. Her room had a panic button, and a security guard was posted at the end of the hall. Nurse Rita stayed past her shift, sitting by the window while Eleanor drifted in and out of sleep. But Eleanor couldn't rest, not because of fear, but because of a memory that had been scratching at the back of her mind. A few months before the fall, she had overheard Vanessa on the phone, her voice low and excited, talking about a policy that would finally make things right. Eleanor had assumed it was about car insurance. Now she realized it might have been something far darker. She asked Croft to look into any financial instruments taken out in her name, life insurance policies, annuities, changes to her will. What he found made him call an emergency meeting with the prosecutor. Vanessa had taken out a guaranteed issue life insurance policy on Eleanor's life 6 months earlier, with a death benefit of $500,000. The named beneficiary was not Michael, not the grandchildren, but Vanessa herself. There was no medical exam required for the policy, just a signature from the insured. The signature on the form was a jagged scrawl that looked nothing like Eleanor's handwriting. It had been forged. And the timing coincided exactly with the week Eleanor had first complained of severe stomach pains. But it got worse. When Croft subpoenaed the financial records for the Phoenix house, he discovered that Vanessa had taken out a home equity line of credit against the property 1 year ago, using a forged power of attorney document that named her as Eleanor's legal representative. The document was signed by a notary whose license had been revoked 6 months prior for fraud. The bank had released nearly $200,000 in credit, which Vanessa had used to pay off her own debts and to fund a lavish vacation the previous summer, the same vacation Eleanor had not been invited to. The house that Eleanor owned, the house she had been locked inside and slowly starved within, had been used as collateral for Vanessa's secret escape. When the evidence was presented to Michael, he sat in the attorney's office with his head in his hands. His face was gray, his eyes hollow. He kept repeating, "I didn't know. I didn't know about any of it." But Croft was not convinced. He played a clip of the hidden camera footage from the kitchen, obtained from the cloud storage Vanessa had failed to delete. The footage showed Eleanor, thin and trembling, trying to open the refrigerator, only to be intercepted by Vanessa, who snatched a carton of milk from her hand and replaced it with a different one, marked with a red sticker. Michael was visible in the background, sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling his phone. He looked up for a split second, saw the exchange, and then looked back down. He had seen. He had known, at least on some level, that his wife was controlling his mother's food. And he had chosen not to act. Confronted with the frame-by-frame stills, Michael broke down. "She told me Mom was hoarding spoiled food, that she had dementia and was making herself sick. I believed her because it was easier." Eleanor watched this confession from a video link in her room. She didn't cry. She had moved past tears into a kind of steeled clarity. Her son had not been innocent. He had been complicit. And now the prosecution was adding a charge of negligent endangerment against him as well. The public narrative shattered overnight. The tabloid that had run the Grandma Evic's family headline retracted the story and published a full front-page correction. Family poisoned grandmother for insurance payout, police say. The accompanying photo was no longer of Vanessa looking like a victim, but her booking photo, eyes narrowed, jaw tight, taken just hours after her arrest on charges of attempted murder, forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and elder abuse. Bail was denied. Michael was released on his own recognizance but ordered to have no contact with Eleanor. But Vanessa still had one move left. From the county jail, she made a single phone call, not to her lawyer, but to a distant cousin who lived on the outskirts of town, a woman with a record of her own. Using coded language that the jail recording later captured, Vanessa instructed the cousin to visit Eleanor at the facility, pretending to be a volunteer from a church group. The plan was simple: gain access, administer a high dose of insulin hidden in a syringe, and leave. In exchange, the cousin would receive a cut of the life insurance payout when Vanessa eventually won her case. The cousin agreed. But what Vanessa didn't know was that Detective Harper had already obtained a warrant to monitor all of Vanessa's jail communications. The call was intercepted in real time. The cousin was arrested at the facility's front desk before she ever made it past security. Eleanor was informed of the thwarted attempt by Detective Harper personally. The detective sat down across from her and said, "Mrs. Monroe, you've been through more than anyone should have to endure. But we have her now. We have everything. The trial is set for next month, and we need you to testify." Eleanor nodded slowly. She was still frail, but there was a new light in her eyes, a focused, unwavering flame. She asked for a mirror, and when she looked at her reflection, she saw not a victim, but a survivor. She saw the woman who held the title, who had signed the eviction notice, who had once built a life from nothing. That woman was not gone. She had just been buried under pain. And now she was ready to stand up in a courtroom and tell the world exactly what had happened. The night before the trial, Eleanor sat with Nurse Rita and Daniel Croft in a quiet conference room, reviewing her testimony. Her voice was stronger now, her mind clear. She had gained back 8 pounds, the color had returned to her cheeks, and her hands no longer trembled when she held a glass. She asked Croft one final question. "When this is over, can I go back to my house?" Croft hesitated. The house was legally hers, but it was filled with the ghosts of betrayal. "You can. But whether you want to is another matter." Eleanor thought of the kitchen where she had been fed poison, the hallway where she had fallen, the bedroom with no lock. She thought of the garden George had planted, the windows that had once let in warm desert light. Then she said, "I'll decide after I've spoken my truth." The morning of the hearing, the courthouse was crowded. Cameras lined the steps. Inside, Vanessa sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, her face a mask of cold fury. Michael sat in the gallery, separated from his children who were being cared for by a neutral relative. Eleanor entered the courtroom leaning on a cane but walking upright. She took the witness stand, swore the oath, and looked directly at Vanessa. The prosecutor asked her first question. "Eleanor, can you tell the court what happened the day you moved into your son's home?" Eleanor took a deep breath, and the entire room leaned forward. Because everyone knew that the words about to come out of her mouth would not only decide the fate of her daughter-in-law, they would resound far beyond the courtroom walls. Eleanor's voice filled the courtroom, quiet but unwavering. "I arrived at my son's house the day after my husband's funeral. I was still wearing the dress I had worn to the cemetery. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. Vanessa met me at the door with a plate of cold gray meat and said, 'Leftovers. Eat up.'" She paused, steadying herself. I thought it was a small slight. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe she didn't like me. I told myself it would get better. It never did. The prosecutor walked her through each stage of the ordeal: the sour milk, the bulging cans, the sandwiches with curling edges, the remarks about her weight loss and stress. Photographs of the spoiled food were projected onto a screen. Bank records showed Vanessa purchasing groceries for the family, and a separate, much smaller receipt for items marked with red stickers, discount goods close to expiration, that were reserved for Eleanor. The jury saw the video from the kitchen camera, Vanessa swapping the fresh milk for an expired carton, while Michael watched and did nothing. They saw the pharmacy footage, the forged power of attorney, the life insurance policy, the jailhouse call plotting Eleanor's murder. They saw the photographs of Eleanor upon intake at the clinic, a woman of 78, weighing just 91 pounds, her collarbones sharp as bird bones. Vanessa's defense attorney tried to paint Eleanor as a confused old woman with a grudge. "Isn't it true that you resented your daughter-in-law for not lowering your rent years ago? Isn't this whole story an act of revenge?" Eleanor looked directly at him. "I didn't remember the rent dispute until the nurse asked me about it. It was so small, so long ago I had forgotten it entirely." But Vanessa didn't forget. She reminded me every day, not with words, but with what she put on my plate. Her voice cracked, but she held the attorney's gaze. "You don't serve someone rotted food for a year because you're stressed. You do it because you want them to disappear." The turning point came when Nurse Rita took the stand. She walked the jury through her initial visit, the half-eaten applesauce, the question that had changed everything. Then she produced her medical logs, blood work showing severe malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies consistent with starvation, muscle wasting, and dangerously low albumin levels. "In my 22 years of nursing," Rita said, "I have never seen a case of neglect this deliberate. Eleanor was not just being underfed. She was being fed food that was biologically hazardous. This was a slow poisoning." The forensic accountant followed, detailing how Vanessa had extracted the home equity line, forged the signature, and used the money to pay off credit cards and book a Hawaiian getaway for herself and her friends. The life insurance agent testified that Vanessa had called repeatedly, pressing for a policy with no medical exam, asking specifically about the payout timeline. She said she wanted to protect the family if Eleanor's health declined. The agent found the call so unsettling she noted it in the file. That note became a crucial piece of evidence. The jury deliberated for just over 4 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, Eleanor's hands were folded on the wooden railing in front of her. The foreman stood and read the verdicts: guilty on all counts, attempted murder, elder abuse, forgery, financial exploitation, conspiracy to commit murder. Vanessa let out a sharp, guttural sound, half a sob, half a shriek. Her attorney held her arm, but she shook him off, her composure crumbling into something feral. The judge sentenced her to 25 years to life without the possibility of parole for the attempted murder charge, plus consecutive terms for the financial crimes. She would not see the outside of a prison wall until she was an old woman herself. Michael sat in the gallery, his face blank. He had not been charged with a crime, but the public had already convicted him in its own way. Friends distanced themselves. His employer placed him on administrative leave after the footage aired on the news. His children were temporarily in foster care while family services assessed his fitness as a parent. After the sentencing, he approached Eleanor in the hallway. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have protected you." Eleanor looked at her son, the boy who had drawn her as a superhero, who had once brought her tulips, who had allowed her to waste away under his roof. "You saw enough," she said. "You just chose not to act." She turned and walked away, leaning on her cane, but walking on her own terms for the first time in a year. The story reverberated far beyond the courtroom. Local news stations ran hour-long specials on elder abuse, using Eleanor's case as the stark centerpiece. Advocacy groups shared her photo on social media. Strangers wrote letters praising her courage. The Arizona state legislature fast-tracked a bill to strengthen penalties for caregivers who willfully neglect vulnerable adults, naming it Eleanor's Law. She was invited to speak at the bill signing, and although she declined the podium, she stood beside the governor as he signed it, her hand resting on the desk. The bill passed unanimously, but the most surprising twist came a month later. A woman named Carol, who had watched the trial coverage from her nursing home in Tucson, contacted Daniel Croft with a story eerily similar to Eleanor's. She was an elderly widow whose daughter-in-law had been feeding her spoiled food for 2 years, isolated her from friends, and pressured her to sign over the deed to her home. She had been too frightened to come forward until she saw Eleanor on the news. Croft took her case pro bono, and within months, a second abuser was behind bars. Then, a third woman called. And a fourth. Eleanor's testimony had not just freed her, it had ignited a wave of disclosures. The forgotten women of Arizona were finding their voices, and Eleanor, frail, soft-spoken Eleanor, had become an unlikely hero. Eleanor did return to the house on that quiet Phoenix street, but not to live. She walked through the empty rooms one last time, running her fingers along the walls where Michael's height marks still showed faintly from his childhood. She looked at the garden George had planted, now overgrown with weeds, and made a decision. She sold the house. The profit, combined with the returned home equity funds that were clawed back by the court, gave her enough to purchase a small bungalow in Sedona with a view of the Red Rocks, the place she and George had always dreamed of retiring to, but never could. She planted a new garden with lavender and rosemary and hung a wind chime on the porch that sang softly in the canyon breeze. The documentary concludes. Eleanor sits in her Sedona garden, looking healthier, fuller, her cheeks pink from the high desert sun. She holds a framed photo of George, the same one she had kept beside her bed during the darkest nights. "I thought I had lost everything when he died," she says, her voice calm and steady. "But I found something else. I found out that I'm not as fragile as everyone thought, and I learned that sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the loudest truth." She smiles, a genuine smile that reaches her eyes. "They forgot I held the title. Now I hold something even more important. My life." The camera pulls back as the desert wind stirs the lavender and the sun sets behind the red rocks. It is not a revenge story. It is a resurrection. Anti-Viction map. It is not a revenge story. It is a resurrection. Eleanor didn't just reclaim a house, she reclaimed her voice, her dignity, and the truth that had been buried under a year of quiet suffering. But her story is not an outlier. It's a mirror. In every community, there are women like Eleanor, mothers, grandmothers, widows, who are tucked into spare bedrooms, handed the expired food, told to be grateful for a roof, and slowly erased from the family portrait. They are called burdens. They are called forgetful. And too often, they are believed. The most chilling part of Eleanor's ordeal wasn't the forged documents or the tampered medication. It was the silence of a son who scrolled past his mother's starvation, the silence of neighbors who never asked, the silence of a system that almost failed her. And the only thing that shattered that silence was a single question from a nurse who paid attention. One question. That's all it took to crack open a prison that had been built meal by meal, lie by lie. It's a stark reminder that abuse doesn't always look violent. Sometimes it looks like a cold plate of leftovers and a locked door. That's why we tell these stories. This is Grandma True Stories, where the voices that were once ignored finally take center stage. We share the untold accounts of women who were discarded, underestimated, and pushed to the margins, only to discover that their strength was never gone, just waiting. These are not fairy tales. They are real, raw, and proof that being kind doesn't mean being weak, and being old doesn't mean being invisible. So if Eleanor's story resonated with you, If it reminded you of someone who needs to be seen, or if it sparked a question you've never dared to ask, then you belong here. Hit subscribe, share this story, and become part of a community that refuses to look away. Because when a grandma speaks, the world finally listens.